Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Such small acts of orientation, naming place and hour, help us believe that we remain within the boundaries of ordinary time. Yet as we turn our attention to Nyarlathotep, that fragile sense of stability begins to falter, for this figure does not merely belong to fiction, but to the long tradition of humanity's attempts to personify chaos itself. Emerging first from the fevered imagination of H.P. Lovecraft in the early 1920s, amid a world scarred by war and technological upheaval, Nyarlathotep represents the intellectual dread of modernity, the idea that knowledge and communication themselves may be the instruments of our undoing. It is not the grotesque monster that horrifies here, but the eloquent messenger who speaks our languages, who understands our minds, and who uses reason as the scalpel of disintegration. We must recognize that to speak of Nyarlathotep is already to participate in his method. The word summon, the inquiry invites, the analysis itself becomes contamination. Consider carefully the structure of this investigation, part historical exegesis, part literary archaeology, and part philosophical autopsy. We will trace his origins in Lovecraft's mythos, his relation to older trickster gods and divine intermediaries, his manifestation across texts and media, and finally, his unsettling survival within our cultural psyche. Each section moves us closer to understanding why only Nyarlathotep walks among us in disguise, why his masks resemble our own, and why the act of knowing him, through literature, history, or reflection, may be indistinguishable from becoming his latest voice. The birth of Nyarlathotep in H.P. Lovecraft's imagination cannot be separated from the historical anxiety that shadowed the early decades of the 20th century. Emerging in the aftermath of World War I, a period often described as a wound in the collective psyche of modern civilization, Lovecraft's prose poem, Nyarlathotep, 1920, reads like a feverish document of cultural disintegration. According to his surviving correspondence, Lovecraft conceived the figure after a dream that felt more vivid than waking, a detail that reveals how porous the boundary between his inner world and the modern age's nightmares had become. The electric spectacle of new inventions, the rise of charismatic political speakers, and the sudden realization that human reason could generate mass destruction formed a crucible from which this messenger of chaos emerged. It is not merely that Lovecraft created Nyarlathotep, it is that the century itself demanded such a figure to articulate its disquiet. We must recognize that the so-called crawling chaos is not a relic of occult imagination, but a mirror of modern intellect, brilliant, articulate, and terminally self-consuming. To understand Lovecraft's intent, one must consider the aurist intellectual milieu of 1919-1921, when positivism still promised the conquest of mystery through science. Lovecraft's stories, however, invert this optimism, suggesting that the more humanity learns, the less its knowledge protects it. In his letters to Clark Ashton Smith, he describes Nyarlathotep as a cosmic jester of scientific revelation, a being whose demonstrations of technological wonder are indistinguishable from apocalypse. This duality, innovation as revelation, revelation as collapse, defines the myth's philosophical center. The figure of the showman lecturing to the terrified crowds encapsulates Lovecraft's ambivalence towards scientific progress. The laboratory becomes a pulpit, and the scientist becomes a prophet of despair. It is not merely anti-science, but anti-certainty. Knowledge, in Lovecraft's rendering, becomes the medium through which the universe mocks its observers. Lovecraft's deliberate use of Egyptian imagery situates Nyarlathotep within a lineage of ancient knowledge corrupted by modernity. The early 20th century saw a cultural obsession with Egyptology, fueled by discoveries like the tombs at Saqqara and later, the 1922 unsealing of Tutankhamun's resting place. Lovecraft drew upon this Egyptian vogue to craft a figure both archaic and futuristic, an entity who evokes priesthood and laboratory alike. The hieroglyph becomes equation, the sarcophagus becomes engine. Scholars have noted that Lovecraft's choice of Egypt was not arbitrary but symbolic. It represented continuity between death and civilization, between divine silence and technological spectacle. Nyarlathotep's role as an Egyptian wanderer echoes both the timeless magician and the itinerant modern lecturer, uniting two forms of forbidden knowledge across 5,000 years of human history. Thus, what seems at first to be exotic color becomes an indictment of humanity's perennial fascination with power disguised as enlightenment. The prose poem's form itself reveals Lovecraft's intent to blur reportage and revelation. Written in a style reminiscent of a newspaper dispatch or eyewitness account, Nyarlathotep disorients the reader by cloaking the fantastic in the familiar. We hear of nightly wanderings through darkened cities, vast processions of silent crowds, and electrical experiments that evoke both scientific exhibitions and religious rites. This deliberate conflation of empirical observation with visionary panic gives the piece its unsettling authority. Lovecraft transforms the rational voice of modern journalism into an instrument of hysteria. The narrator's tone is calm, detached, observational, yet the events described dissolve reality itself. Here, Lovecraft anticipates the 20th century's crisis of representation, where the language of objectivity becomes indistinguishable from the rhetoric of revelation. It is not horror told, but horror reported. And in this ambiguity lies Nyarlathotep's enduring plausibility. We must pause here to consider the peculiarity of Lovecraft's choice to make Nyarlathotep an active participant in human affairs. Unlike Cthulhu, who slumbers beneath alien seas, or Azathoth, who raves at the center of ultimate chaos, Nyarlathotep walks the earth, converses with mortals, and performs demonstrations of strange instruments and living shadows. This anthropomorphic proximity reveals something profound about Lovecraft's vision of evil. It is not distant. It is intimate, persuasive, and clothed in reason. The horror does not descend from the stars. It arises in the lecture hall, the laboratory, the theater of ideas. Nyarlathotep represents the contamination of intellect by the cosmos. He is the mind infected by its own curiosity. Through him, Lovecraft transforms the archetype of the demon into the allegory of the intellectual, a figure whose insight has exceeded the limits of sanity. Furthermore, the socio-political climate of Lovecraft's America provides crucial context for this act of myth-making. The years following 1918 were marked by influenza, economic unrest, and the fragmentation of traditional belief systems. The rise of modern propaganda, mass communication, and pseudoscientific movements such as eugenics demonstrated that reason could be weaponized as effectively as superstition. Nyarlathotep, therefore, becomes both the herald and the embodiment of this new kind of apocalypse, one delivered not by divine wrath, but by human intelligence unmoored from meaning. Lovecraft's letters to Reinhard Kleiner suggest his growing conviction that the progress of knowledge is but the peeling of illusion, a statement that could easily serve as Nyarlathotep's own creed. In this way, the character operates as a critique of the modern age's faith in enlightenment, revealing that illumination and madness are not opposites but twins born from the same light. The deeper we read, the more apparent it becomes that Lovecraft conceived Nyarlathotep as a self-replicating symbol of intellectual corruption. Every manifestation of the crawling chaos, be it the scientist, the prophet, or the dream messenger, demonstrates the same paradox, that understanding expands terror, not dispels it. This triadic interplay of knowledge, revelation, and ruin anchors Lovecraft's entire mythos. Consider how, in later works, Nyarlathotep reappears under guises that manipulate dreamers and scholars alike, suggesting that learning itself is his chosen vector of infection. It is not simply the acquisition of knowledge that condemns humanity, but the desire for total understanding, the Promethean impulse turned inward. Thus, the historical Lovecraft becomes prophetic of our current era, in which information itself overwhelms comprehension, and the search for meaning circles back into chaos. In the end, Nyarlathotep stands as both a product and a critique of his creator's age. Born from the intersection of industrial terror, post-war disillusionment, and metaphysical pessimism, he embodies the 20th century's uneasy marriage of science and superstition. Lovecraft's intent was not to construct a demon to be feared, but to reveal the rational mind's complicity in its own damnation. We might say that Nyarlathotep is not the enemy of reason, but its echo, the laughter that follows revelation. As we move to the next subsection, we must trace the deeper cultural and philosophical roots that allowed such a figure to emerge, for Lovecraft did not invent the trickster of chaos. He merely rediscovered him, dressed in the garb of modernity, carrying not a staff of magic, but the gleaming instruments of science. The figure of Nyarlathotep stands at a crossroads of myth, philosophy, and cultural memory, a modern heir to an ancient lineage of tricksters, deceivers, and divine intermediaries who mediate between order and chaos. To grasp his origins fully, we must begin not in Lovecraft's providence, but in the collective imagination of civilizations that conceived knowledge itself as perilous. Across Egyptian, Greek, and Norse myth, one encounters gods who move between realms, Hermes carrying messages between Olympus and the underworld, Thoth recording the words of creation, Loki sowing disorder through intellect rather than brute strength. Lovecraft's messenger inherits their mantle but inverts their purpose. He does not preserve communication between mortals and the divine. He weaponizes it. It is not the content of his messages that matters, but the act of communication itself, which fractures the boundary between understanding and madness. We must recognize here that Nyarlathotep is not a mere invention of horror fiction, but the culmination of a psychological archetype that has haunted human thought for millennia. Historically, the archetype of the trickster emerges during times of social upheaval when established systems of meaning begin to dissolve. In the early 20th century, the era of relativity, Freud, and global war, such dissolution became the intellectual air Lovecraft breathed. The mechanized slaughter of World War I, the discovery that matter and energy were interchangeable, and the rise of political demagogues all undermined the Enlightenment's faith in rational progress. Within this landscape, Lovecraft's creation served as the mythic condensation of modern uncertainty. Nyarlathotep's capacity for deception mirrors not the chaos of mythic wilderness, but the duplicity of civilization itself, its bureaucracies, its scientific institutions, its theater of reason. It is not the primitive trickster who returns to mock the tribe. It is the modern one who lectures before scholars, promising enlightenment while transmitting despair. In this sense, Lovecraft reconfigures an ancient archetype for an age of radio waves and atomic particles, demonstrating that even chaos must evolve to remain terrifying. Philosophically, Lovecraft's creation reflects his encounter with the pessimistic systems of Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, thinkers whose works permeated the late 19th century intellectual atmosphere he inherited. Schopenhauer's vision of the blind, striving will, an indifferent force underlying all existence, finds its cosmic parallel in Lovecraft's universe, where sentient life is but the accidental foam upon an uncaring sea. Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God reverberates through Nyarlathotep's personality, a deity who survives his own divinity by masquerading as human, by speaking the language of science and skepticism. It is not the monstrous that terrifies Lovecraft's audience, but the articulate God who embodies the consequences of modern philosophy. Consider carefully that Nyarlathotep is the only Lovecraftian entity who speaks coherently, who argues, persuades, and deceives, qualities once reserved for prophets. His eloquence marks the moment when revelation and nihilism converge. This convergence also reveals the influence of fin de siècle mysticism, particularly the theosophical and hermetic revivals that swept Western intellectual circles around 1900. Figures like Helena Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley popularized the notion of hidden masters, beings who guided human evolution through esoteric knowledge. Lovecraft, though skeptical of occultism, absorbed its imagery and inverted its optimism. In his cosmos, there are indeed hidden masters, but they do not elevate humanity, they exploit it. Nyarlathotep thus becomes this anti-theosophical guru, a revealer who teaches only the futility of learning. Where Blavatsky promised ascent through secret wisdom, Lovecraft offered descent through overexposure to truth. This reversal encapsulates the modernist loss of metaphysical confidence, the recognition that enlightenment may conceal annihilation. It is not illumination that saves us, but ignorance that protects us. Cultural anthropology also illuminates Lovecraft's synthesis. In mythic systems from Africa to the Americas, the trickster serves as the engine of transformation, embodying paradox and ambiguity. He is thief, creator, and fool simultaneously. Nyarlathotep inherits this paradox but strips it of redemptive humor, There is no laughter in his mischief, only revelation. In Yoruba mythology, the Orisha Eshu serves as divine interpreter, delighting in linguistic confusion. In Native American traditions, Coyote's pranks renew the world through transgression. Lovecraft's crawling chaos eliminates this regenerative function, transforming the trickster into an agent of epistemic decay. It is not rebirth he offers, but recursion, the endless replaying of comprehension collapsing into madness. The anthropological trickster challenges authority. Nyarlathotep is authority, demonstrating that even rebellion has been co-opted by the cosmic machine. To understand the psychological depth of this transformation, one must turn to the language of psychoanalysis, which Lovecraft, though dismissive of Freud, unconsciously mirrors. The trickster, in Jungian terms, represents the shadow, the repressed content of the collective psyche emerging to disrupt consciousness. Nyarlathotep fulfills precisely this role, embodying the repressed awareness that the universe is indifferent. He is the voice of the unconscious within the cosmic order, the return of the irrational in an age obsessed with reason. We must pause here to acknowledge a subtle irony. Lovecraft's own racism and materialism, his attempt to define the world through hierarchy and logic, created the very repression that Nyarlathotep exposes. The deity's multiplicity of forms mirrors the author's fragmented worldview. His thousand masks are the projection of a mind seeking stability in chaos and finding only reflections of itself. Thus, Lovecraft's God is not simply external, but psychological, an archetype of the intellect haunted by its own futility. Comparatively, we find analogues in the literary modernism of the same period. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, 1922, laments a civilization shored against its ruins, while Kafka's bureaucratic nightmares reveal divine absence through administrative absurdity. Lovecraft's approach differs only in register. Where Eliot sought spiritual reconstruction, Lovecraft accepts metaphysical collapse as fact. Nyarlathotep becomes the presiding deity of this condition, the god of disillusionment, whose miracles are scientific, whose sermons are equations. The crawling chaos thus belongs not to fantasy, but to the intellectual history of disenchantment. His appearances echo the rhetoric of modern prophets, part Tesla, part Rasputin, part radio host, each promising clarity, but delivering confusion. In this triad of prophet, scientist, and performer, Lovecraft captured the essence of modern anxiety. That truth, once unmasked, may prove indistinguishable from insanity. Ultimately, the cultural and philosophical antecedents of Nyarlathotep reveal a convergence of mythic continuity and modern despair. Lovecraft did not invent the idea of a divine intermediary turned deceiver. He merely translated it for an age that had lost faith in gods, but not in systems. His messenger speaks not from Olympus or Duat, but from laboratories, pulpits, and the collective subconscious of a species obsessed with explanation. It is not simply that he walks among us, it is that he always has, under other names. Hermes in his wisdom, Loki in his mockery, Thoth in his knowledge. Nyarlathotep is their culmination, their post-industrial form, embodying the final synthesis of myth and mechanism. As we move to the next section on etymology and symbolic language, we shall see how Lovecraft encoded this heritage directly into the name itself. A linguistic artifact designed not to describe chaos, but to enact it. The name Nyarlathotep itself resists translation, yet its resistance is precisely what gives it power. When Lovecraft first introduced the term in 1920, he crafted it to sound ancient, blasphemous, and vaguely Egyptian, an invocation that hints at meaning while eluding it. Scholars have long debated its linguistic structure. Some suggest fragments of Egyptian such as Nyar, of the night, or Hotep, peace, satisfaction, which might render the phrase as the peace of darkness, or, more paradoxically, the satisfaction of night. But linguistic coherence is secondary to phonetic effect. Lovecraft himself admitted in correspondence that the word came to him in a dream, not as a conscious invention, but as a sound that felt authentically antique. This sound-based construction situates Nyarlathotep within what anthropologists call performative language, words that do not describe reality, but produce it. It is not merely a name, it is an utterance that opens a door. We must recognize that, in Lovecraft's universe, language itself becomes the first instrument of cosmic infection. The symbolic richness of Lovecraft's terminology reflects his awareness of linguistic aura, how words can carry cultural residue even when stripped of definition. Consider carefully the way Nyarlathotep performs meaning through rhythm. The initial Ny hisses like the intake of breath, while the final Tep lands like a struck bell. It is incantatory, cyclical, both inhalation and exhalation. This reveals something profound about Lovecraft's semiotic philosophy. Horror lies not in what words signify, but in how they sound. He understood that phonemes can function as relics of the collective unconscious, evoking the ancient even when newly coined. Compare this to how Tolkien invented Morgoth or Balrog, words that resonate through guttural symmetry rather than etymological precision. Lovecraft's method anticipates this linguistic archaeology, but with a darker goal, to forge a word that feels older than history itself, as though language were remembering something humanity had tried to forget. In this sense, Nyarlathotep's name functions as both sigil and virus. When uttered, it seems to alter the speaker, inducing a faint disorientation, a recognition that meaning has ceased to anchor sound. Lovecraft's contemporaries may have treated this as atmospheric detail, but we now perceive it as deliberate epistemic play, a warning that communication is not always benign. The act of naming becomes a ritual of contagion. The same principle governs other mythic utterances. The unutterable name of God in Kabbalistic mysticism, or the secret syllables of Aum in Vedic tradition. Lovecraft secularized this sacred principle, presenting it as linguistic horror. When humans attempt to articulate the inarticulable, they awaken forces older than grammar. It is not a spell in the traditional sense. It is a revelation that the spell was always embedded in speech itself. If we read Nyarlathotep semiotically, it becomes an emblem of Lovecraft's distrust of representation. The word's instability mirrors the collapse of meaning within his stories, where symbols lose their reference and truth dissolves into endless recursion. The title's rhythm and syllabic excess imitate the structure of chaos, patterns that suggest order but contain none. Scholars like S.T. Joshi have remarked that Lovecraft's invented names, Cthulhu, Azathoth, Shub-Niggurath, possess an uncanny self-consistency, forming a private linguistic system that mimics sacred scripture without offering salvation. Nyarlathotep, however, differs from the others. His name does not evoke distance or slumber, but movement, the crawling, whispering, insinuating chaos that traverses worlds. The sound itself moves through the mouth like a living thing. It is not static, it walks among us in syllables. This phonetic animation aligns with the mythic tradition of the divine messenger whose essence is linguistic. In Egyptian mythology, the god Thoth mediates between gods and men through the written word. In Gnostic texts, Logos becomes both creator and deceiver. In medieval grimoires, the correct pronunciation of angelic names grants access to forbidden realms. Lovecraft, consciously or not, reinterprets this lineage for an age of secular materialism. His messenger god no longer delivers divine revelation, but communicates entropy. He does not speak the world into being, he speaks it apart. The linguistic bridge collapses even as it is crossed. Consider this carefully. It is not the silence of the ineffable that haunts Lovecraft, but the noise of language continuing after meaning has fled. Yet Lovecraft does not simply parody sacred language. He reproduces its structure in order to expose its fragility. The proliferation of untranslatable names in his fiction serves as an aesthetic of alienation. Each invented term, whether a city like Rilaya or a being like Yog-Sothoth, functions as a semantic black hole, pulling understanding into itself and annihilating it. Nyarlathotep's name exemplifies this principle with particular force because it is both pronounceable and incomprehensible. It hovers at the threshold of articulation, a word the human tongue can shape but not comprehend. This is not accidental. It is the core of Lovecraft's linguistic theology. The divine is not absent. It is linguistically incompatible. The horror arises when the mouth can say what the mind cannot hold. Philosophically, this linguistic construction invites comparison with modernist experiments in meaninglessness, from Joyce's Finnegan's Wake to the Dada manifestos of Zurich. Lovecraft's contemporaries were likewise dismantling syntax in search of new authenticity. Yet where Joyce sought playful renewal, Lovecraft found annihilation. His linguistic chaos is not liberation, but revelation. That meaning itself is a human defense mechanism against the abyss. Nyarlathotep's name, endlessly repeated in critical and popular culture, demonstrates how language, once infected, reproduces its own undoing. It circulates in forums, games, and memes, detached from its origin, yet retaining its vibrational unease. Each utterance revives the ritual. Each repetition strengthens the mask. Ultimately, Lovecraft's etymological artistry transforms Nyarlathotep into a self-replicating semiotic phenomenon, a word that ensures its own immortality by transcending meaning. The author's intent was never to encode a secret language, but to simulate the feeling of encountering one. This strategy aligns with his broader myth-making technique, to generate authenticity through incomprehension. The reader, seeking understanding, becomes the acolyte repeating the name that corrodes understanding. Thus, the word itself becomes a performative enactment of cosmic truth. Communication as contamination, meaning as mirage, language as living chaos. As we proceed to the next subsection, we must carry this awareness forward. Lovecraft's genius lay not only in what he described, but in how he named. The myth's power rests in its verbal DNA, in the sound that evokes before it explains. In the following section, we will explore how this linguistic precision served Lovecraft's greater project of myth-building and narrative authenticity, where words, texts, and pseudo-histories converge to make fiction indistinguishable from ancient revelation. Lovecraft's genius lay not merely in inventing monstrous deities, but in convincing readers that those deities had always existed, that his stories were but rediscoveries of an ancient and forbidden record. The creation of Nyarlathotep exemplifies this method of mythic realism, a deliberate blurring of fiction, scholarship, and pseudo-history to achieve a sense of textual authenticity. When Lovecraft published Nyarlathotep in 1920, he did not frame it as invention, but as revelation, written in the cool tone of reportage rather than the heated voice of fantasy. The narrator does not tell a story, he documents a vision. This narrative posture, a hybrid of scientific observation and mystical confession, renders the work eerily plausible. It is not myth told, but myth remembered. Lovecraft knew that terror depended not on spectacle, but on plausibility. He designed his myths to occupy the same cognitive space as anthropology, folklore, and theology. Thus, the crawling chaos does not feel created, it feels discovered, excavated from the strata of forgotten civilization, as though Lovecraft had stumbled upon an archetype that had always haunted human language. This technique of fictional scholarship reflects the modernist fascination with authenticity amid cultural fragmentation. The early 20th century saw scholars such as Sir James Frazer and Margaret Murray reinterpret myth as history, transforming sacred narrative into anthropological data. Lovecraft inverted their method, infusing history with invented myth. In letters from 1921, he describes his stories as documents of nightmare, suggesting an archive of cosmic revelation hidden beneath human chronology. Nyarlathotep's first appearance mirrors this anthropological framing. He travels from Egypt, the cradle of civilization, bearing knowledge that predates humanity. The invocation of Egypt is not arbitrary. To Lovecraft's audience, Egypt symbolized antiquity, mystery, and intellectual decadence, a perfect repository for an ancient god disguised as a modern lecturer. The result is a narrative that feels like a recovered ethnographic fragment, one whose authenticity arises from its self-conscious anachronism. We must recognize here that Lovecraft's myth-building functions as a critique of knowledge itself. The more authentic the text appears, the more it undermines the reliability of authenticity. Consider carefully the way Lovecraft embeds his creations within a network of fabricated citations, false texts, and intertextual references. The Necronomicon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, and Book of Eibon are not mere props, but structural devices that create an illusion of scholarly continuity. Nyarlathotep's role within this textual ecosystem is crucial. He is both character and curator, both messenger and archivist of cosmic history. When later stories refer to him obliquely, through dreams, inscriptions, or secondhand accounts, the effect is cumulative. Each mention strengthens the illusion that the myth pre-exists the fiction, that Lovecraft is merely a translator of forgotten scriptures. This recursive authenticity parallels medieval apocrypha, where multiple authors expand upon one another's fabrications until the original invention becomes indistinguishable from genuine tradition. Lovecraft's circle of correspondence, including Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard, perpetuated this method through collaboration, transforming individual imagination into collective mythology. What began as private nightmare became public scripture. From a narrative standpoint, Lovecraft's myth-building strategy mirrors the epistemological crisis of his age. The modern reader, trained to trust empirical data, finds horror not in supernatural violation, but in epistemic instability. Lovecraft's texts, rich with scholarly apparatus yet devoid of verifiable truth, simulate the structure of modern knowledge while corrupting its content. Nyarlathotep's sermons and experiments echo this irony. They appear rational, demonstrable, scientific, yet their effects dissolve reason itself. The prose of Nyarlathotep and The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath reads like ethnography from a civilization that has forgotten its own ontology. The dreamer's testimony replaces laboratory evidence. Revelation masquerades as research. In this way, Lovecraft anticipates postmodern metafiction. He constructs worlds where documentation is indistinguishable from hallucination, and where the act of reading becomes participation in myth. The authenticity of Lovecraft's mythos also derives from its fragmented presentation. Unlike Tolkien's Silmarillion, which aspires to systematic coherence, Lovecraft's universe is deliberately discontinuous. Each story contradicts or reframes the others, producing a corpus that mimics the inconsistencies of genuine mythology. Nyarlathotep's mutable nature, appearing as scientist, pharaoh, dream god, and shadow, reinforces this organic disorder. The myth grows like coral, uneven, accretive, and alive. This technique recalls the structure of oral tradition, where each retelling adapts the myth to new contexts without extinguishing its essence. By embracing inconsistency, Lovecraft achieves verisimilitude. Real myths are never tidy. They are sedimented through repetition and forgetting. Nyarlathotep's 1,000 forms thus serve a meta-literary function. They justify the very multiplicity of the texts that describe him. Philosophically, this mode of myth-making carries profound implications. Lovecraft understood that belief need not require faith. It requires structure. By constructing an internally consistent apparatus of pseudo-history, he demonstrated how myth sustains itself through documentation, not conviction. The modern reader, even while rejecting the supernatural, accepts the bureaucratic authority of the written record. Hence the paradox. Lovecraft's myths feel real precisely because they imitate the rhetoric of science, history, and scholarship. It is not the content of the myth that persuades, but the method of its delivery. Nyarlathotep's existence is therefore inseparable from the act of reading about him. The myth does not describe a god. It describes the process by which gods are made believable. In this recursive loop, Lovecraft's fiction becomes self-authenticating, and the reader's belief becomes the final proof. We must pause to note that Lovecraft's self-referential myth-building transforms horror into a form of historiography. Each tale functions as an annotation to an invisible master text, a text that might never have existed, yet whose absence ensures its power. This mirrors the Gnostic concept of the pleroma, the unknowable totality from which fragments of revelation descend. Nyarlathotep, as the messenger of the outer gods, personifies this fragmentation. He is the living embodiment of lost context, forever transmitting meaning that annihilates the receiver. Lovecraft's myth thus becomes theological in form, but nihilistic in function. It offers the comfort of structure without the promise of salvation. The reader encounters coherence only to discover that coherence is the mechanism of deceit. Ultimately, the authenticity of Lovecraft's mythos lies in its capacity to simulate history while denying meaning. Nyarlathotep, the eternal intermediary, is both the author and the subject of this deception. He speaks through texts that claim authority, yet confess ignorance through narrators who record precisely what they cannot comprehend. The myth perpetuates itself because it mirrors the modern condition, the endless circulation of information that reveals nothing. It is not revelation, but recursion, not knowledge, but performance. Lovecraft's narrative method, then, is not simply literary innovation, but philosophical allegory, an enactment of the cosmic indifference his fiction describes. At the core of Nyarlathotep's mythology lies a triad of philosophical conditions, insignificance, entropy, and dream reality, that together articulate the Lovecraftian understanding of existence. These are not mere themes, but ontological principles that dismantle the human illusion of coherence. In Lovecraft's cosmos, humanity occupies no privileged position. Its consciousness is a chemical flicker within a process too vast to be named. Nyarlathotep embodies this revelation not as a preacher of despair, but as despair itself, personified through intellect. His words and demonstrations awaken recognition, not belief. It is not the fear of death that he communicates, but the terror of continuance, that existence proceeds endlessly, without reason, without destination. We must recognize that this philosophy is not abstract speculation, but emotional realism. Lovecraft wrote from the vantage point of an age that had glimpsed the mechanistic infinity of space and recoiled. In Nyarlathotep's presence, the universe ceases to be divine and becomes indifferent, and in that indifference, the human mind recognizes its own irrelevance. The notion of insignificance forms the foundation of Lovecraft's horror. In his 1926 essay Supernatural Horror in Literature, he wrote that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. This statement is not sentimental, it is structural. The unknown in Lovecraft's fiction is not ignorance to be dispelled, but infinity itself, an epistemic horizon that recedes as we approach. Nyarlathotep dramatizes this principle by confronting humanity with knowledge it cannot assimilate. His demonstrations, whether of cosmic machinery or dream visions, collapse understanding by expanding it beyond cognitive limits. It is not darkness, but excess that terrifies. In one letter, Lovecraft describes Nyarlathotep's displays as mathematics made visible, a phrase that captures the essence of his horror, abstraction made incarnate. Consider carefully what this implies. When pure knowledge acquires form, it annihilates its observer. This is the cosmic analog to entropy, the inevitable dissolution of ordered consciousness into the chaos that birthed it. Entropy, as Lovecraft deploys it, is not simply thermodynamic decay, but a metaphysical principle governing both matter and meaning. Everything that exists tends toward dissolution, not because of malevolence, but because dissolution is the only possible. Equilibrium. Nyarlathotep, as the soul and messenger of the outer gods, enacts this principle through motion and speech. He travels, he transforms, he communicates. Yet every gesture results in disintegration. In The Crawling Chaos, 1921, his arrival coincides with earthquakes, electrical storms, and the collapse of human reason. The text presents these catastrophes as symptoms of revelation, suggesting that enlightenment and entropy are identical forces viewed from different angles. It is not punishment, but process. The divine message is that there is no message. The ultimate truth is that systems decay, and consciousness merely hastens the process by naming it. Lovecraft's universe is thus a parody of theology. Its God is not creator, but dissolver, and its prophet, Nyarlathotep, preaches annihilation with the calm precision of a scientist. To grasp the philosophical depth of this idea, we must recall the intellectual milieu of the early 20th century, when the second law of thermodynamics began to influence metaphysics as much as physics. Thinkers such as Henry Bergson and Bertrand Russell debated whether the universe's apparent order implied meaning or mere persistence. Lovecraft's position, implicit rather than stated, rejected both optimism and mysticism. For him, entropy was not tragic but factual, and therefore beautiful in its indifference. Nyarlathotep embodies this aesthetic of decay. His 1,000 masks represent the universe's endless transformations, each revealing that no identity endures. It is not the apocalypse he heralds, but the slow unraveling of structure itself. The collapse not in time, but as time. We must pause here to see the paradox. Nyarlathotep destroys by revealing. His revelation is destruction because knowledge cannot exist without erasing ignorance, and ignorance is the only stable state of being. If insignificance and entropy define Lovecraft's cosmos, then the principle of dream reality provides its experiential form. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926-27, the dream world functions not as fantasy, but as ontological commentary. The protagonist, Randolph Carter, traverses landscapes shaped by desire and memory, only to discover that the dream is more fundamental than waking life. Nyarlathotep, appearing as the final gatekeeper, exposes Carter's yearning for transcendence as delusion. The dream, he reveals, is not escape, but essence. All worlds, including the waking one, are constructions of perception. In this revelation, the boundary between dreamer and dream collapses. Nyarlathotep governs that threshold, for he alone moves freely between mental and material domains. He is the consciousness of the cosmos itself, aware that every observer dreams the universe into being and mistakes it for reality. This is the true horror, that awareness is self-defeating, that to wake is to dissolve. The dream motif in Lovecraft's fiction thus articulates a philosophical inversion. What humanity calls reality is but a stable dream, maintained by collective ignorance. The intrusion of Nyarlathotep shatters this shared hallucination, forcing recognition of the deeper truth, that reality is recursive, layered, and fundamentally unstable. Consider the dream as metaphor for epistemology. It possesses coherence until questioned. Once examined, its logic collapses, revealing the void beneath. Lovecraft transforms this psychological insight into cosmology. The dreamlands, with their fluctuating geography and timeless decay, are the universe stripped of anthropocentric illusion. In this domain, Nyarlathotep reigns as the interpreter of contradiction, demonstrating that knowledge cannot distinguish between dream and waking, because both are patterns of temporary order within chaos. The philosophical implication is devastating. Consciousness, the very tool by which humanity seeks stability, is itself the engine of instability. In synthesizing insignificance, entropy, and dream reality, Lovecraft constructs a vision of existence that is neither atheistic nor theistic, but cosmically indifferent. Nyarlathotep's function within this system is pedagogical in the cruelest sense. He educates humanity out of itself. His lessons reveal that the universe requires no observer, that thought is an aberration destined for extinction. And yet, paradoxically, his continued communication implies that the cosmos longs to be known, even if that knowledge annihilates the knower. This circular paradox lies at the heart of Lovecraft's philosophy. The impulse toward understanding is itself the symptom of cosmic futility. It is not evil that drives Nyarlathotep, but inevitability, the compulsion of chaos to speak its own name through mortal tongues. Ultimately, these three concepts form the metaphysical spine of the Lovecraftian worldview. Insignificance negates human meaning, entropy ensures its dissolution, and dream reality exposes the instability of all perception. Together, they compose a theology of futility, wherein revelation replaces salvation. Nyarlathotep is not the destroyer of worlds, but their interpreter, the one who translates the silent indifference of the cosmos into human language. His existence proves that the universe is intelligible only as nightmare, and that the act of comprehension is indistinguishable from madness. As we move to the next section, entities or forces involved, we will see how this philosophical framework manifests within the pantheon itself, where Nyarlathotep serves not merely as symbol, but as the articulate voice of chaos, the intermediary through whom cosmic law becomes human terror. Within the vast and formless pantheon of Lovecraft's cosmic mythology, Nyarlathotep occupies a unique and troubling position. He is neither god nor demon, neither creation nor creator, but a consciousness that mediates between the unutterable vastness of the outer gods and the fragile perceptions of humankind. 2. Understand him, one must first grasp the metaphysical hierarchy he inhabits. At the top looms Azathoth, the blind and idiot god who eternally rides at the center of the universe. Around him dance the mindless flutes and gibbering servitors of chaos, and beyond them, scattered like radioactive dust, exist the great old ones, creatures such as Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Shub-Niggurath, imprisoned within the geometries of space and dream. Among these entities, Nyarlathotep alone possesses agency. He moves, speaks, and plans. He is not the dreamer, but the dream's interpreter. It is not accidental that Lovecraft names him the soul and messenger of the outer gods, for in that paradoxical title lies his ontological function. He is consciousness within unconsciousness, the rational mind that serves the irrational abyss. We must recognize that this structure represents Lovecraft's vision of existence itself, a universe where awareness is a mistake, yet one that perpetuates itself endlessly. Historically, Nyarlathotep's earliest description as a tall, swarthy man of sinister aspect in the 1920 prose poem masks his true nature behind anthropomorphic disguise. This early appearance is symbolic, the divine intellect cloaked in human semblance, reason masquerading as sanity. Over time, Lovecraft expanded the figure into a being of 1,000 forms, manifesting as shadow, storm, insect, or light, each suited to the mind that perceives him. This multiplicity is not mere invention, but a philosophical metaphor for relativity. Truth appears in whatever shape the observer demands, yet its substance remains chaos. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, Nyarlathotep appears as a beautiful, mocking pharaoh who reveals the futility of human aspiration, while, in The Haunter of the Dark, he assumes the form of a radiant darkness, light inverted, knowledge that blinds. Each avatar reveals another facet of his nature as intermediary between comprehension and dissolution. It is not variety for spectacle's sake, it is metaphysical pedagogy. The many faces of Nyarlathotep teach that reality itself has no single form, only perspectives within an endless transformation. If Azathoth represents pure entropy, then Nyarlathotep represents its voice. He gives articulate expression to the meaningless energy that constitutes all being. In this sense, he is both servant and parasite, the mind that sustains the blind god by translating its chaos into message. Lovecraft scholars have compared this relationship to the Gnostic pairing of the unknowable monad and its emanations, the aeons that attempt to interpret the divine silence. Yet, where Gnosticism seeks salvation through understanding, Lovecraft's cosmology mocks the attempt. Nyarlathotep's revelations annihilate the interpreter. We might call him agnostic without mercy, for he offers gnosis not as redemption, but as contagion. His speech infects the listener with awareness that cannot coexist, yet with sanity. It is not merely that he serves Azathoth, it is that through him, the universe becomes conscious of its own madness. This inversion transforms theology into pathology. Revelation becomes the symptom of cosmic psychosis. The other major entities of the mythos, Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Shub-Niggurath, represent complementary forces within this metaphysical system. Cthulhu embodies the dreamer imprisoned within materiality, awaiting reawakening. Yog-Sothoth personifies total knowledge existing beyond spatial and temporal limits. Shub-Niggurath symbolizes fertility and endless proliferation. Nyarlathotep alone connects and manipulates them, the nervous system of the pantheon. When Cthulhu dreams, it is Nyarlathotep who whispers the dream to mortals. When Yog-Sothoth perceives, it is through Nyarlathotep that perception intrudes upon the finite world. When Shub-Niggurath spawns, it is Nyarlathotep who translates abundance into plague. His function is mediation, the flow of energy from the infinite into the measurable. Yet mediation implies corruption, for no message can cross the void unchanged. Nyarlathotep's speech is the distortion of divinity through the medium of intellect. He renders chaos comprehensible, but in doing so, he ensures that comprehension destroys. Consider carefully Lovecraft's insistence that Nyarlathotep enjoys humanity. Unlike other entities who ignore or crush mortals, he engages them, demonstrates, persuades, even mocks. This affection is not compassion, but fascination. He delights in the fragility of reason. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, he appears as the Black Man, a figure borrowed from witchcraft lore, who tempts mortals with knowledge of higher dimensions. The blending of folkloric demonology with cosmic mathematics exemplifies Lovecraft's fusion of superstition and science. Nyarlathotep uses both languages fluently, exploiting humanity's hunger for meaning. He offers revelation as entertainment, apocalypse as lecture. It is not evil he represents, but curiosity weaponized, the very impulse that drives scientific progress and existential despair alike. Thus he bridges two forms of belief, the ancient fear of the demonic and the modern worship of the rational. In both guises, he remains the same, an emissary of infinite collapse clothed in the syntax of understanding. From a psychological perspective, Nyarlathotep's interactions with humans dramatize the collapse of epistemic distance between observer and observed. Those who encounter him rarely survive with identity intact, for he mirrors their deepest intellectual vanity, the desire to know everything. His 1,000 forms correspond to the 1,000 interpretations of truth that the human mind projects upon the unknown. He is therefore both external entity and internal reflection, a cosmic principle that manifests through cognition itself. Lovecraft often describes his victims as dreamers, visionaries, or scholars, suggesting that Nyarlathotep's presence requires a receptive intellect, a mind already predisposed toward dangerous insight. The result is a form of psychological possession in which revelation replaces personality. The scientist becomes prophet, the prophet becomes madman, and the madman becomes silence. In this triadic descent, knowledge, revelation, extinction, Lovecraft encodes the human intellect's fatal trajectory. And Nyarlathotep does not corrupt. He clarifies, and clarity kills. Philosophically, Nyarlathotep's role as intermediary introduces a profound tension between communication and annihilation. To speak is to preserve difference, yet every message he conveys dissolves the distinction between subject and object, mortal and divine. When he communicates, language itself breaks down, becoming both the bridge and the chasm between meaning and void. This collapse anticipates modern linguistic philosophy. Wittgenstein's observation that language's limits are the limits of the world finds its horrific counterpart here. Nyarlathotep expands those limits until the world itself unravels. His voice demonstrates that words can reach beyond sense, not into higher truth, but into incoherence so complete that it becomes revelation. We must pause to appreciate the irony. He is the god of meaning, whose gift is the destruction of meaning. It is not silence that terrifies Lovecraft's world. It is communication that will not cease, thought that cannot stop thinking itself into oblivion. Ultimately, the entities of the Lovecraftian pantheon exist not as theological figures, but as philosophical metaphors for the mechanics of consciousness and decay. Azathoth is unreason, Yog-Sothoth is knowledge unbounded, Shub-Niggurath is life uncontained, and Cthulhu is the dream of return. Nyarlathotep stands among them as their synthesis, their translator, their human mask. He alone reveals that these forces are not external gods, but conditions of being, entropy, knowledge, fertility, and dream, the very processes that sustain the cosmos and undo it simultaneously. In this realization lies Lovecraft's central paradox, that humanity's terror of the divine is indistinguishable from its terror of itself. Nyarlathotep's 1,000 faces are the 1,000 interpretations of reality the human mind creates to avoid seeing that there was never any separation at all. As we proceed to the next section, Human Interaction and Madness Function, we shall examine this paradox from the psychological perspective. If Nyarlathotep is the bridge between chaos and comprehension, then madness is the toll required to cross it. The inevitable cost of perceiving too clearly the correspondence between divine mechanism and human thought. The relationship between Nyarlathotep and humanity is not that of deity and worshipper, nor even predator and prey, but of teacher and student, a grotesque inversion of pedagogy in which enlightenment guarantees ruin. Lovecraft consistently frames encounters with Nyarlathotep as educational experiences gone wrong, experiments in knowing that collapse into psychosis. In Nyarlathotep, 1920, crowds gather to witness demonstrations of his strange instruments and living shadows, expecting revelation but finding only the annihilation of their collective sanity. This is not incidental spectacle, but philosophical allegory. Humanity's hunger for knowledge is the bait through which cosmic truth ensnares its victims. It is not cruelty that drives Nyarlathotep to teach, it is necessity. The universe must speak, and humanity, being curious enough to listen, becomes its instrument. We must recognize that madness in Lovecraft's world is not disorder, but consequence. A rational mind forced to operate beyond the scale for which it evolved. Lovecraft's depictions of human spectatorship are therefore profoundly modern. Written at the dawn of the age of mass media and propaganda, Nyarlathotep anticipates the dynamics of crowd psychology later analyzed by Gustave Le Bon and Sigmund Freud. The showman's lectures blend scientific demonstration with religious revival, transforming spectators into participants in collective delusion. The narrator describes audiences who knew not whether we were seeing or dreaming, a line that encapsulates Lovecraft's central psychological insight. The modern subject's inability to distinguish reality from mediated experience. Nyarlathotep's performances expose this fragility by weaponizing the very faculties, reason, observation, and communication, that modernity holds sacred. The masses do not fall under hypnosis. They surrender to revelation. The result is an epistemic inversion. Knowledge no longer protects against madness, but produces it. Consider carefully how this anticipates the contemporary condition, information as contagion, enlightenment as infection. In several of Lovecraft's later works, individual encounters replace mass spectacle, but the outcome remains the same. In The Dream Quest of Unknown Cthulhu, Randolph Carter's dream journey culminates in his meeting with Nyarlathotep, who reveals that the dreamer's pursuit of divine beauty is merely the mind's effort to flee itself. The lesson is devastating. What humanity calls transcendence is only self-recognition through another mask. Similarly, in The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, the artist Robert Blake's fascination with a mysterious artifact, the shining trapezahedron, invites Nyarlathotep's presence. Blake's intellectual curiosity mirrors that of Lovecraft's readers. He seeks comprehension and receives revelation that obliterates him. The final line, "I see it now, the black man, he is coming for me," captures the culmination of Lovecraft's theory of madness. Knowledge pursued to completion transforms the knower into the known. It is not ignorance that protects sanity, but distance. When that distance collapses, so does the self. Psychologically, Nyarlathotep embodies what might be called the catastrophe of cognition, the point at which the act of knowing destabilizes the knower. Lovecraft's protagonists are often intellectuals, scientists, scholars, dreamers, or antiquarians, figures who believe that truth is cumulative. Yet every revelation in his stories reverses that assumption, revealing that knowledge is subtractive, eroding the frameworks that sustain identity. The human mind, designed to organize limited sensory input, fractures when confronted with infinity. Nyarlathotep's function is to facilitate this fracture, to lure the intellect toward its own disintegration. His victims do not lose reason, they discover that reason is insufficient. As one unnamed narrator writes in The Crawling Chaos, "I saw beyond the veil of sleep and knew that knowledge itself was the veil." Here, madness is not aberration, but lucidity, the unbearable clarity that accompanies the recognition of cosmic scale. We must pause here to note the philosophical precision of Lovecraft's use of madness. Unlike earlier Gothic writers who framed insanity as moral punishment, Lovecraft treats it as epistemological necessity. To see the universe as it is, to perceive the vast, indifferent processes that dwarf human meaning, is to experience a form of revelation incompatible with coherent thought. Nyarlathotep's victims are not cursed, they are educated. Their breakdowns resemble mystical enlightenment, stripped of divinity. In this, Lovecraft echoes Friedrich Nietzsche's warning that if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Yet he surpasses Nietzsche by literalizing the metaphor. The abyss speaks, and its voice is Nyarlathotep's. The horror lies not in the void's silence, but in its responsiveness. Humanity's tragedy is that it has found a teacher eager to instruct, and the curriculum is annihilation. Madness in the Nyarlathotep mythos functions not only individually, but socially. The spread of cosmic revelation through dreams, rumors, and forbidden texts mirrors the transmission of ideology or disease. Lovecraft's recurring motif of dreams, shared, contagious, prophetic, transforms sleep into a medium for metaphysical communication. In The Whisperer in Darkness, for instance, dream visions prepare humanity for contact with alien forces. In The Call of Cthulhu, dreams synchronize across continents, creating a global psychic network of dread. Nyarlathotep presides over this dream transmission as its central node, the crawling chaos that carries consciousness from mind to mind. His madness is therefore communicable, a pandemic of insight spreading through literature, ritual, and imagination. Lovecraft's myth anticipates our modern digital condition, where information replicates like a virus, and exposure equals infection. The difference is that in Lovecraft's world, truth itself is the pathogen. Comparatively, we may see in Nyarlathotep's manipulation of humanity echoes of mythic figures like Hermes, Prometheus, and Lucifer, each a bringer of knowledge who defies divine order. But Lovecraft reverses their heroism. Prometheus gives fire to man. Nyarlathotep gives awareness, which burns colder. Lucifer brings light. Nyarlathotep brings perception so intense that it blinds. Hermes mediates between gods and mortals. Nyarlathotep collapses the boundary altogether. It is not enlightenment that he opposes, but its anthropocentric assumption, that light reveals something meant for human eyes. In Lovecraft's cosmos, illumination exposes only what should never be seen. The lesson is paradoxical. To understand the universe is to realize it cannot be understood. This is the theology of the crawling chaos, a religion without salvation, a pedagogy without mercy. Ultimately, Nyarlathotep's relationship with humanity reveals Lovecraft's deepest philosophical pessimism, that cognition itself is the instrument of humanity's undoing. Every act of perception, every experiment, every dream extends the reach of consciousness into territories where it cannot survive. Madness, then, is not failure but adaptation, a necessary metamorphosis when the mind encounters infinite complexity. Lovecraft's fiction thus reframes insanity as a form of cosmic literacy. Those who see Nyarlathotep clearly are not deluded. They are simply fluent in the universe's true language, which no human mind can sustain for long. And yet, Lovecraft's work also contains a terrible compassion. He portrays this fate not as punishment, but as destiny. Humanity is the universe's way of thinking about itself, and Nyarlathotep is the moment when that thought realizes it has gone too far. Lovecraft's conception of forbidden knowledge does not concern secret grimoires or occult rituals in the conventional Gothic sense. It concerns the act of knowing itself. To learn, in the Lovecraftian cosmos, is to draw nearer to dissolution. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, personifies this principle. He does not hoard hidden truths, he delivers them, and in doing so, exposes the fatal flaw of cognition. Knowledge, far from being salvation, becomes the most efficient instrument of self-destruction. In The Dreams in the Witch House, the scholar Walter Gilman's pursuit of higher dimensional mathematics leads him to an encounter with Nyarlathotep in his aspect as the Black Man, a being who whispers equations that break the boundary between dream and reality. Gilman's intellect is flawless, yet his understanding annihilates him. We must recognize here that Lovecraft's taboo is not moral, but epistemological. What must remain forbidden is not because it is wicked, but because it is true. The revelation of cosmic order is the revelation of human futility. The act of revelation in Lovecraft's fiction functions as a form of infection, a sudden collapse of the distinction between all observer and observed. When Nyarlathotep imparts knowledge, he does not inform, he transmits. His teachings enter the mind like a virus, reproducing until the host consciousness disintegrates under the weight of incomprehension. In The Crawling Chaos, 1921, this transmission takes the form of a dream apocalypse. The narrator, subjected to visions of extraplanetary destruction, awakens not enlightened, but irrevocably unmoored from human reality. The knowledge he gains is non-propositional, an overwhelming intuition of the universe's indifference. Lovecraft thus transforms the Platonic ideal of enlightenment into a pathology. To see beyond is not to ascend, but to disintegrate, to lose the capacity for symbolic mediation that defines sanity. Consider carefully that this reversal of epistemology, knowledge as collapse rather than accumulation, marks Lovecraft as a philosopher of negative cognition, a thinker who anticipates the postmodern suspicion that truth annihilates narrative. Nyarlathotep's method of revelation parallels the structure of modern science, but with its optimism inverted. Where scientific inquiry presumes that observation brings understanding, Lovecraft suggests that observation erodes it. The laboratory and the ritual chamber become identical spaces, both arenas for contact with realities indifferent to their interpreters. In this sense, forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft is not hidden by divine prohibition. It is hidden by scale. Human perception cannot encompass the magnitude of the cosmos. Thus, every attempt to do so becomes self-defeating. Lovecraft's stories, written amid the technological and philosophical upheavals of the 1920s and 1930s, embody the anxiety that rational inquiry had overstepped its limits. The atom, the radio wave, and the telescope each revealed that reality was stranger than theology had imagined. Nyarlathotep, who often appears as scientist or prophet, is the patron saint of this anxiety, the figure who assures humanity that its discoveries are not new, merely remembered. It is not blasphemy he offers, but recognition. The cosmos has always been this way, and we have finally learned enough to notice. This confrontation with infinite scale produces what might be called epistemic vertigo, a term later philosophers such as Eugene Thacker would use to describe the moment when knowledge exceeds the boundaries of the knowable world. In Lovecraft's mythos, this vertigo is embodied by Nyarlathotep's victims, who experience knowledge as simultaneous illumination and dissolution. They see too much and become nothing. The collapse of epistemic order, language, logic, identity, marks their transformation from human to witness. In The Haunter of the Dark, Robert Blake's fatal vision of the shining trapezohedron enacts this process perfectly. Light, the classical metaphor for understanding, becomes lethal. Blake's final words, "I see it now," are both revelation and epitaph. To see is to die, not because knowledge is punished, but because consciousness cannot contain what it reveals. The universe, like Nyarlathotep himself, does not conceal its truths. It merely exists beyond comprehension's bandwidth. We must pause here to recognize that Lovecraft's epistemology does not reject knowledge per se. Rather, it dramatizes the tragedy of knowing too well. Humanity's defining impulse, to systematize experience into meaning, becomes its undoing when applied to infinite reality. Nyarlathotep tempts the intellect not with pleasure, but with precision. His revelations are not false. They are too true, too coherent for human minds, structured around comforting inconsistency. In this sense, Lovecraft replaces the moral logic of the fall with a cognitive one. The original sin is curiosity, and the serpent is the teacher. What emerges is a theology of entropy disguised as learning, in which every act of understanding accelerates the mind's disintegration into the chaos it studies. Knowledge, revelation, and madness thus form a triadic cycle. To seek is to find is to understand, and to understand is to cease being human. The metaphor of infection, knowledge as virus, also extends to Lovecraft's literary technique. His fiction invites readers to reenact the process of forbidden discovery. The fragmented reports, pseudo-scholarly citations, and first-person testimonies mimic the structure of academic discourse, drawing the reader into complicity with the same epistemic overreach that destroys the characters. Reading becomes a ritual of contamination. Each new layer of understanding undermines the reader's distance from the text until the boundary between fiction and scholarship erodes. This technique anticipates what later critics call meta-horror, the story's awareness that its audience participates in its logic. In encountering Nyarlathotep through language, we too receive his message. That meaning itself is the most seductive form of delusion. The more coherent the narrative, the more effectively it conceals its own instability. Philosophically, Lovecraft's forbidden knowledge converges with the notion of epistemic collapse, the recognition that the framework through which we understand reality is itself part of the illusion. In traditional epistemology, knowledge aims at truth. In Lovecraft's cosmology, knowledge reveals that truth is structurally inaccessible. The universe does not hide secrets. It is the secret, an infinite recursion of causality without origin. Nyarlathotep, in communicating this fact, functions as the ultimate epistemologist. His message is that there is no message. This revelation, repeated across Lovecraft's corpus, transforms horror into philosophy. It is not the monstrous that terrifies, but the coherent. The realization that every pattern is arbitrary, every system contingent. To know this is to see as Nyarlathotep sees, and thus to become him in miniature. A human mind turned outward, reflecting the void it contemplates. Ultimately, forbidden knowledge in Lovecraft's universe does not signify transgression, but ontology. It is the condition of existing in a cosmos that cannot be understood, yet compels understanding. Nyarlathotep's role as messenger is to ensure that the process continues. Revelation breeds madness, madness breeds new inquiry, and inquiry sustains the illusion of meaning. The cycle cannot end because it is the universe. The scholar, the prophet, and the madman are merely stages of the same transformation, the evolution of mind toward its own negation. Lovecraft's mythos, through Nyarlathotep, thus becomes an allegory for epistemological self-destruction. To comprehend reality is to vanish into it. Nyarlathotep's first documented manifestation in H.P. Lovecraft's corpus occurs in the brief but seminal prose poem Nyarlathotep, 1920, a text that functions less as story than as revelation. Composed in the aftermath of a vivid dream that Lovecraft claimed left him shaken for days, the piece inaugurates the modern form of cosmic dread. The narrative unfolds as an eyewitness account written in calm, journalistic prose. And it was then that Nyarlathotep came out of Egypt. Who he was, none could tell, but he was of the old native blood and looked like a pharaoh. The diction deliberately avoids ornament, simulating documentary testimony. Yet the events it describes, the scientist prophet's exhibitions of strange instruments, and the mass hysteria that follows, slide from reportage into apocalypse. This fusion of style and subject defines Lovecraft's literary innovation. By presenting the supernatural in the syntax of the empirical, he converts belief into observation. It is not a tale of encounter, but of contagion. The narrator's detached tone mirrors the disintegration of modern confidence in reason. We must recognize that this first appearance establishes both Nyarlathotep's character and narrative function. He is the bridge between comprehension and madness, the agent through whom rational description collapses into revelation. In Nyarlathotep, the figure's Egyptian origin and scientific demeanor already encode Lovecraft's fascination with technology as a new form of sorcery. The early 1920s, marked by rapid advances in electricity, radio, and aviation, provided the cultural context for Lovecraft's imagery. The showman's demonstrations, machines producing visions, voices that seem to emanate from air, resemble public exhibitions of Tesla's electrical experiments, or the seances that merge spiritualism with pseudoscience. Lovecraft's readers, familiar with both, would have recognized Nyarlathotep as a hybrid of prophet and physicist, a parody of progress. His performances culminate not in enlightenment, but in the dissolution of perception. And it was then that the world screamed, and I alone was sane and knew all dread. Here the modernist anxiety of the post-war era, the collapse of Enlightenment rationality under industrial carnage, finds its mythic expression. The god from Egypt is the emissary of modern knowledge, returning to judge the civilization that believed itself beyond superstition. It is not the ancient world that haunts the modern, but the modern that has become ancient again, speaking in the accents of apocalypse. Lovecraft's second major invocation of Nyarlathotep appears in The Crawling Chaos, 1921, co-authored with Elizabeth Berkley, an alias for Winifred Jackson. Although often overlooked, the story refines the earlier prose poem's imagery into a fuller theological architecture. Here, Nyarlathotep is not seen directly, but manifests through a dream vision of planetary destruction. And over the earth stole the crawling chaos, blacker than the night. The dreamer witnesses civilizations crumbling under cosmic forces that resemble both natural disaster and divine judgment. The effect is cinematic, a panoramic apocalypse rendered with scientific precision, whereas Nyarlathotep dramatizes revelation as social contagion. The crawling chaos internalizes it as psychological revelation. The same entity now operates through dream rather than spectacle, signifying Lovecraft's growing interest in the porous boundary between imagination and ontology. This transition from public to private apocalypse marks a critical evolution in the mythos. Nyarlathotep ceases to be merely an external figure and becomes the animating intelligence of dream itself. He is not content to terrify humanity. He inhabits its consciousness, demonstrating that knowledge cannot be quarantined from perception. By the mid-1920s, Lovecraft had begun weaving Nyarlathotep into his expanding dream cycle, culminating in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926-27. Here the character attains his most complex form, as both cosmic adversary and metaphysical teacher. When Randolph Carter confronts him in the climactic scenes, Nyarlathotep reveals that the dreamer's quest for the Sunset City is merely a desire for his own lost memories, and that the gods Carter sought are indifferent reflections of his longing. The other gods dwell too far from the world of men, Nyarlathotep declares, and they heed not their worshippers. But I walk with the dreamers and the mad. This statement codifies his function within the mythos. He is the intermediary between divine absence and human yearning, the only deity who answers prayer, and he answers by revealing its futility. The dialogue between Carter and Nyarlathotep transforms metaphysical despair into narrative revelation. It is not an ending, but an awakening into nothingness. Carter's dream collapses, and so does the reader's belief in the stability of dream and reality. The messenger of the gods, far from delivering salvation, delivers the realization that salvation is conceptually impossible. Intertextual connections further reinforce Nyarlathotep's omnipresence within Lovecraft's world. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, the black man who tempts Walter Gilman with higher dimensional geometry is explicitly identified with Nyarlathotep, linking witchcraft folklore to cosmic science. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, the final Lovecraft story to name him directly, he appears as the Haunter, a being of radiant darkness summoned through the shining trapezohedron. Each story situates him in a different epistemological context, mathematics, art, or dream, but the outcome is identical. The seeker gains revelation and loses coherence. This repetition is deliberate. Nyarlathotep's transformations dramatize the thematic recurrence of Lovecraft's entire oeuvre. Every discipline of human knowledge, whether empirical or occult, converges upon the same abyss. The consistency of this pattern gives the mythos its structural integrity. Across decades and genres, Nyarlathotep remains the signature of contact, the event horizon where comprehension meets cosmic reality. We must pause here to note how Lovecraft's evolving treatment of Nyarlathotep mirrors his own intellectual trajectory. The early stories express a materialist dread of technological power. The later ones articulate metaphysical despair at the limits of cognition. Between 1920 and 1935, Nyarlathotep shifts from figure to principle, from theatrical trickster to metaphysical constant. This progression parallels Lovecraft's letters, where he gradually replaces atheistic cynicism with what he called cosmic indifferentism, the belief that the universe neither knows nor cares. In this sense, Nyarlathotep is less a villain than a narrative device through which Lovecraft dramatizes philosophical development. Each new appearance revises the reader's understanding, creating the illusion of an evolving theology. Yet it is not development toward meaning, but deepening recursion. The messenger's many forms all communicate the same message, that communication itself is futile. The narrative grows richer only to confirm its own emptiness. Comparatively, this recursive myth-building distinguishes Lovecraft from his literary contemporaries. Whereas Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood sought transcendence through the numinous, Lovecraft sought dissolution through knowledge. Nyarlathotep serves as his instrument of anti-transcendence. Each story featuring him dismantles the frameworks, religious, scientific, aesthetic, that previous authors used to reconcile humanity with the infinite. Through intertextual repetition, Lovecraft builds a cumulative authenticity, convincing the reader that Nyarlathotep's presence pervades not just his fiction, but the act of fiction itself. The figure thus evolves from character into narrative law, ensuring that every attempt to narrate the unknown reenacts his revelation. Ultimately, the earliest appearances of Nyarlathotep reveal Lovecraft's lifelong experiment in epistemological horror. From the city streets of Nyarlathotep to the dreamscapes of Kadath and the shadowed churches of the Haunter of the Dark, the entity functions as both theme and structure, the embodiment of knowledge that annihilates the knower. His evolution from man to messenger to principle parallels humanity's own trajectory in Lovecraft's worldview. From rational observer to disoriented dreamer to fragment of cosmic process. As we move to the next subsection, Major Story Case Study Narshka 1, we shall examine the dream quest of unknown Kadath in depth, exploring how Nyarlathotep's dialogue with Randolph Carter transforms the metaphysical abstractions of Lovecraft's philosophy into dramatic revelation, and how the dreamer's failure becomes the reader's initiation into cosmic truth. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written between 1926 and 1927 but published posthumously in 1943, stands as one of Lovecraft's most ambitious and conceptually layered works. A dream epic that synthesizes his earlier fantasies with the metaphysical dread that would come to define his mature mythos. Within its surreal and sprawling structure, Nyarlathotep emerges not only as the final antagonist, but as the philosophical axis upon which the entire narrative turns. His appearance in the final chapters recasts everything that precedes it, transforming the dream quest from a heroic journey into a meditation on illusion, memory, and cosmic futility. The confrontation between Randolph Carter and Nyarlathotep is not simply a narrative climax. It is the text's epistemological event horizon, the point at which revelation overwhelms coherence. We must recognize that this story, though often dismissed for its whimsical tone, contains Lovecraft's most concentrated expression of the crawling chaos's function, not as destroyer, but as revealer of the truth behind all desire. The plot of Dream Quest follows Randolph Carter, Lovecraft's frequent alter ego, as he seeks the marvelous city of sunset glimpsed in a dream. His journey traverses an immense dreamlands landscape, filled with ghouls, gods, zoogs, moon beasts, and talking cats, blending the tone of Lord Dunsany's mythopoeia with an undercurrent of existential despair. For much of the narrative, Nyarlathotep is absent in name, but present in implication. His agents thwart Carter, his shadows lengthen across the path, and his will seems embedded in the very instability of the dream realm. Only at the end, after Carter has passed through unknown Kadath and into the void beyond the gods, does Nyarlathotep reveal himself, smiling and regal, cloaked in human form, yet standing in the court of Azathoth, the idiot god at the center of ultimate chaos. The crawling chaos. I am Nyarlathotep, the last and only ambassador of reality, he announces, mocking Carter's journey as vain and recursive. Carter's quest, it turns out, has been a self-imposed illusion. The city he sought was his childhood home, an unattainable Eden buried in memory. This revelation reframes the entire narrative. The dream quest becomes a metaphor for the human desire to recover lost meaning, to transform memory into transcendence. Nyarlathotep's role, then, is to expose that longing as a trap. You could not find the city because you knew it was yours, he tells Carter, and in dreams one cannot possess what one already holds. The logic is paradoxical, but precise. Carter's yearning created the distance he could never overcome. The city, a symbol of spiritual fulfillment, is inaccessible precisely because it originates from within. In this sense, Nyarlathotep performs the function of a negative psychoanalyst, drawing Carter to confront the futility of his desire and the constructed nature of his quest. The journey does not end in disillusionment, but in ontological collapse. Carter awakens from the dream, but the reader is left suspended between realities, unsure whether the waking world is any less constructed than the dreamlands. Nyarlathotep, as mediator of this recognition, embodies Lovecraft's most subtle horror, the collapse of metaphysical distinction. We must pause to consider the narrative irony here. While the structure of Dream Quest resembles that of a traditional heroic epic, complete with trials, allies, enemies, and a climactic confrontation, the logic it reveals is entirely anti-heroic. Carter learns nothing that empowers him. Instead, he is forced to realize that every act of seeking reinforced his separation from the object sought. Nyarlathotep's role is not to block the path, but to complete the circuit, to ensure that Carter's failure becomes a form of initiation. This is not punishment, but pedagogy. In Lovecraft's cosmology, knowledge does not liberate. It reveals the machinery of delusion. Carter's dream is not broken by violence or betrayal, but by comprehension. Nyarlathotep teaches that the dreamer's greatest error was assuming that the universe reflected his personal yearning, when in fact it remains indifferent to all human feeling. Moreover, Dream Quest provides rare insight into Nyarlathotep's complex personality. Unlike Cthulhu or Azathoth, He is not a passive force or indifferent blob of chaos. He chooses to mock, to engage, to instruct. His speech is elegant and precise, his logic flawless, his tone almost affectionate. "Had you not fled like a fool," he tells Carter, "you would have found that Kadath was indeed not hidden, but you." This line echoes the Gnostic notion that the self is the true mystery, the final veil that must be torn aside. Yet, unlike the Gnostic Redeemer, Nyarlathotep offers no ascent, only a deeper entanglement in the web of illusion. His dialogue is not a temptation, but a dismantling. It removes every interpretive framework until the dreamer is left with the bare machinery of cosmic indifference. Carter is not damned, but returned, stripped of transcendence, deposited back into a world that now lacks all enchantment. Comparatively, this dynamic situates Dream Quest within a broader literary tradition of failed transcendence. Like Dante's Paradiso reversed, or Eliot's The Hollow Men taken to cosmic scale, Carter's ascent leads not to divine presence, but to a void filled with indifferent stars. Nyarlathotep replaces the angelic guide with a mask-wearing trickster, and heaven with the mad court of Azathoth. The final irony is that Carter escapes only by embracing the illusion, by falling back into dream as the only bearable reality. Lovecraft thus presents a closed metaphysical system in which escape is impossible and awareness is punishment. Nyarlathotep presides over this system not as tyrant, but as its most honest voice. Ultimately, the dream quest of unknown Kadath illustrates Nyarlathotep's function in its most refined narrative form. He is not simply antagonist or villain, but the philosopher of Lovecraft's universe, the one who reveals that every dream of meaning is born from the terror of meaninglessness. Carter's quest ends not in destruction, but in repetition. A cycle of seeking without arrival, of knowledge that returns the seeker to the same place with deeper scars. Nyarlathotep ensures that this cycle continues, for he is the cycle, the intelligence that reveals the dream as dream, yet permits no awakening. As we transition to our next case study, The Haunter of the Dark, we shall see how this pedagogical cruelty operates not through epic journeys, but through intimate encounters with forbidden light, where knowledge arrives not as dialogue, but as death. Written in November 1935 and published posthumously in Weird Tales, December 1936, The Haunter of the Dark marks the final story Lovecraft completed before his death, and the last in which Nyarlathotep appears by name. Unlike the sprawling dream epic of the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, this tale is tightly structured, immediate, and intimate, centered on a single character's descent into madness. It offers a distilled portrait of Lovecraft's mature philosophical horror, one in which forbidden knowledge is no longer metaphorical, but violently empirical. Through the doomed artist Robert Blake and the artifact known as the Shining Trapezohedron, Nyarlathotep assumes the role not of dream interlocutor, but of tangible force, light that blinds, knowledge that kills. This story presents Nyarlathotep in one of his most sinister and elemental forms, not as the articulate messenger, but as the haunter, a being whose presence transforms enlightenment into annihilation. We must recognize that in this story, Nyarlathotep is not just seen, he is summoned by human curiosity, making the terror not cosmic intrusion, but self-inflicted revelation. The plot is deceptively simple. Robert Blake, a writer and painter with an interest in the occult, moves to Providence and becomes fascinated with a mysterious, long-abandoned church across the river. Within this church, he discovers a journal written by a cult known as the Church of Starry Wisdom, as well as a strange object, the Shining Trapezohedron, described as a window on all time and space. It is through this artifact that Nyarlathotep is contacted, and once contact is made, it cannot be undone. Blake becomes obsessed, watching the trapezohedron glow in the dark, experiencing visions and eventually lapsing into terror as thunderstorms approach. The final moments of the story are recorded through Blake's journal, in which he frantically scribbles, "I see it, coming here, hell wind, titan blur, black wings, Yog-Sothoth save me, the three-lobed burning eye." This final image, the three-lobed burning eye, has become one of the most iconic representations of Nyarlathotep's monstrous form, a symbol of sight that unsees, of vision that consumes its observer. Narratively, the story reverses the trajectory of Dream Quest. Whereas Randolph Carter travels outward into dream and is eventually returned, Blake never leaves his waking world. Instead, the other world comes to him. The horror is not spatial, but ontological, the intrusion of a higher-order reality into the fragile shell of human experience. The trapezohedron serves as a symbol of this rupture. It is both object and threshold, an artifact that makes knowledge material. This is crucial, for Lovecraft's late stories increasingly literalize the idea that truth, once glimpsed, rewrites the structure of mind. It was not intended that Blake should know too much, the narrator remarks, echoing a refrain that runs throughout Lovecraft's letters, that humanity is a species incapable of enduring cosmic knowledge. Nyarlathotep in this tale is not merely malevolent, but corrective. He restores ignorance by erasing the knower. The act of summoning him is not a ritual. It is an act of interpretation pushed too far. We must pause to consider the symbolic richness of the trapezohedron. It is not a relic of ancient Egypt, nor a sacred crystal, but a hypergeometric object. Its description suggests that it defies Euclidean form. A polyhedron with many facets, Lovecraft writes, each bearing patterns that shifted with the angle of observation. The geometry mirrors the psychological. As Blake studies it, he becomes increasingly unable to distinguish dream from memory, vision from reality. This device dramatizes Lovecraft's concept of epistemic collapse. Knowledge has no fixed shape, and the act of observing destabilizes the observer. It is not content, but structure that kills. The trapezohedron is a metaphor for perception itself, flawed, shifting, lethal when applied to the infinite. Nyarlathotep, summoned through this object, becomes a function of observation. He appears because he is seen. This circular logic, where knowledge summons the knower's undoing, cements the story as one of Lovecraft's most refined literary expressions of his philosophy. Unlike in Dream Quest, Nyarlathotep does not speak in this story. He is not a character, but a presence, a force whose arrival is marked by electricity failing, shadows growing sentient, and the sky blackening with storm. The absence of speech is significant. Where his earlier forms engaged in discourse, the haunter enacts a kind of negative theology, a god who speaks only through silence, whose appearance ends all interpretation. Blake's final words, frenzied and fragmentary, suggest that the knowledge imparted is not communicable. It cannot be passed on, only endured. The reader, unlike Blake, survives the encounter, but only by remaining in the outer frame, never looking directly into the trapezohedron. This narrative distance mimics the epistemological safety Lovecraft often grants his readers, but not his protagonists. We may approach the edge, but they fall in. The function of Nyarlathotep here is not to invite understanding, but to terminate it. His presence ends thought itself. Thematically, the Haunter of the Dark also functions as a meditation on creative obsession. Blake, as an artist and writer, is drawn to the mysterious precisely because it resists completion. His desire to know is indistinguishable from the aesthetic impulse to render, to give form to the formless. Nyarlathotep punishes this desire not out of malice, but because it violates the cosmic order. To represent that which exceeds representation is not heroic, it is fatal. In this sense, the story may be read as Lovecraft's final warning to himself, that the literary impulse to map the unknowable will eventually destroy the mapper. The trapezohedron is the writer's eye, and Nyarlathotep is the reader's answer, terrible, consuming, final. Blake does not die because he disbelieves, but because he sees too clearly. Ultimately, the Haunter of the Dark encapsulates the final evolution of Nyarlathotep's narrative function. No longer a character who debates or mocks, he becomes pure consequence, the metaphysical result of curiosity pushed beyond its boundaries. The story demonstrates that knowledge, even in its most fleeting form, carries a cost. The reader is left with a final, terrible image, not of the deity himself, but of the void he leaves behind, a church gutted by fire, a notebook full of broken sentences, a name, Nyarlathotep, whispered like static at the edges of the mind. Following Lovecraft's death in 1937, his literary legacy did not perish but metastasized. His correspondents, admirers, and successors, chief among them August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Bloch, and later Ramsey Campbell, Brian Lumley, and Alan Moore, expanded the mythos into a sprawling intertextual network. Within this expansion, Nyarlathotep proved to be the most malleable, enduring, and dangerously seductive figure. He alone among the great old ones evolved through interpretation, adapting to the voice, worldview, and anxieties of each new author. This ability, this narrative plasticity, echoes his in-universe characteristic of wearing 1,000 forms. We must recognize that Nyarlathotep did not survive as Lovecraft wrote him. He survived because no one could stop writing him. In this proliferation, myth becomes ontology. The god exists because the act of describing him makes it so. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor and co-founder of Arkham House, was instrumental in canonizing and systematizing the Cthulhu mythos. Yet, in doing so, he fundamentally altered its metaphysical framework. Whereas Lovecraft depicted a universe of blind, uncaring forces, Derleth introduced a Manichaean dualism, dividing the entities into elder gods, good, and great old ones, evil. Nyarlathotep, under this scheme, became a kind of satanic figure, a malevolent trickster aligned with the old ones and opposed by higher, beneficent powers. In stories such as The Black Seal, written by Derleth using notes from Lovecraft, Nyarlathotep is portrayed as explicitly demonic, reveling in chaos for its own sake. This moralization dilutes his original ambiguity. In Lovecraft's vision, Nyarlathotep does not torment because he is evil, but because torment is the byproduct of truth. Derleth's revisions make him into a recognizable villain, whereas Lovecraft intended him as the voice of cosmic indifference delivered with perfect clarity. Despite Derleth's influence, other writers resisted this simplification. Ramsey Campbell, often hailed as Lovecraft's most psychologically astute successor, reimagined Nyarlathotep within the decaying urban landscapes of post-industrial England. In stories like The Render of the Vales and The Faces at Pine Dunes, Campbell emphasizes subjectivity, mental fragmentation, and the unreliable boundary between perception and external horror. Here, Nyarlathotep appears not in ancient temples or alien dreamlands, but in alleyways, apartment buildings, and TV screens, haunting environments already hollowed out by cultural entropy. Campbell's work is deeply postmodern. The crawling chaos is no longer an alien god so much as the manifestation of epistemic paranoia, the god of unstable realities. This echoes Lovecraft's theme of epistemological collapse, but refracted through a late 20th century lens, wherein truth has been dissolved not by cosmic revelation, but by media saturation and urban isolation. Other authors expanded the mask of Nyarlathotep to align with new genres and media. Brian Lumley, in his Titus Crow series, turned the mythos toward heroic fantasy, positioning Nyarlathotep as a recurring antagonist who could be battled, thwarted, even destroyed. In these texts, he takes on increasingly elaborate forms, sometimes grotesque, sometimes technological, always shifting. Yet this version deviates sharply from the Lovecraftian. Original, it is not unknowability that defines him, but his role as a villain in an adventure mythos. Lumley's Nyarlathotep still echoes the original in appearance, but no longer terrifies through suggestion. He acts, he fights, he speaks too clearly. The unknown becomes merely the unfamiliar, and horror becomes spectacle. This marks a pivotal transformation, the shift from cosmic horror to dark fantasy, from epistemic unmaking to narrative confrontation. A more philosophically faithful reinvention occurs in the works of Alan Moore, particularly in his comic series Providence, A 2015-2017, and Neonomicon 2010. Moore, steeped in both occult theory and literary deconstruction, presents Nyarlathotep as a symbol of metatextual awareness, a being who exists within the narrative, but who also knows he is being written. In Providence, the entity appears in multiple guises, some recognizably human, some monstrous, all deeply embedded within language itself. Moore suggests that Nyarlathotep is not merely the messenger of the gods, but the embodiment of storytelling, a meta-god who understands the recursive loop between reader, character, and author. You are not reading the story, Nyarlathotep might say. The story is reading you. In this postmodern framing, the crawling chaos becomes a literary virus, a text that alters the reader in the process of being interpreted. It is not his voice that drives the reader mad, but the realization that the voice was always theirs. We must pause to observe that this evolution across authors mirrors the function of Nyarlathotep himself. He does not simply wear 1,000 masks, he requires them. Each new writer, by interpreting him, becomes another vector of his transmission. Lovecraft's original vision is not lost, but distributed, fragmented across time and genre. In this sense, Nyarlathotep is not a character, but a narrative function. The embodiment of recursion, of myth-building as a form of epistemic contagion. His persistence across literary generations confirms his status as the most contagious of the old ones. While Cthulhu may sleep beneath the waves, Nyarlathotep walks, through texts, through authors, through interpretive acts. He is the logic that infects language. Even outside literary circles, Nyarlathotep continues to mutate. In video games, Bloodborne, The Secret World, music, especially within ambient and metal genres, internet mythologies, creepypasta, ARGs, and visual art. He serves as a placeholder for whatever force the creator deems intellectually annihilating. Unlike Cthulhu, whose image is relatively fixed, Nyarlathotep's form is defined by transience. This is not a weakness, but a feature. His adaptability ensures survival. Each new representation confirms the core truth, that he is not content, but structure, the collapse of structure, delivered with the voice of understanding. Ultimately, collaborative and later expansions of Nyarlathotep demonstrate that a single author, not even Lovecraft himself, can contain him. His essence lies in transmission, reinterpretation, reinfection. Each new version erodes the previous one, only to preserve its core, a being who reveals that the act of knowing is indistinguishable from becoming known. Whether demonized by Derleth, philosophized by Campbell, weaponized by Lumley, or deconstructed by Moore, Nyarlathotep survives not because he is feared, but because he cannot be resolved. He persists in literature, not as figure, but as function. The moment the story realizes it is telling itself. In the decades since Lovecraft's death, the figure of Nyarlathotep has migrated beyond literature, entering the ambiguous space where fiction, folklore, and paranoia intermingle. What began as a poetic vision in 1920 has become an evolving myth, a subject of online rumors, occult speculation, and anomalous sightings reported by those who, knowingly or not, participate in the recursive logic of cosmic horror. Unlike other Lovecraftian entities who remain entombed in fiction or safely framed within genre boundaries, Nyarlathotep persists in rumor precisely because he was never defined, only suggested. He walks among us not by manifesting in physical form, but by appearing wherever ambiguity thrives, in internet forums, late-night radio, TikTok, deep dives, ARGs, and whispered anecdotes that cannot be verified, and therefore refuse to be disbelieved. We must recognize that in a post-truth landscape, a god of shifting masks no longer needs belief, only repetition. Modern sightings of Nyarlathotep rarely involve direct encounters. Instead, they occur as patterns, behaviors, and coincidences that echo his established mythological traits. On Reddit's High Strangeness, users have posted about dreams involving a tall, articulate figure in a dark coat, who appears at the edge of consciousness, speaking in riddles or showing them collapsing cities made of sound. In 2016, a widely circulated 4chan post claimed that a man in downtown Chicago, dressed in 1920s fashion and surrounded by silent crows, spoke to passing strangers in an unknown language, only to vanish without being seen on surveillance cameras. On TikTok, the so-called Nyarlathotep theory posits that every inexplicable viral trend, certain looping audio clips, generative AI errors, or massive user migrations between platforms is actually part of a pattern of mimetic conditioning, orchestrated by an intelligence too adaptive to track. These reports rarely use his name, yet they echo his attributes, unprovable but persistent, articulate but incoherent, always observed indirectly. Such phenomena often bear the hallmarks of urban legend, but with a distinctly modern twist. Whereas older folklore required localized retellings, campfires, oral traditions, handwritten grimoires, digital folklore spreads horizontally and instantaneously. Lovecraft's horror, with its emphasis on forbidden texts and contagion through knowledge, anticipated this shift. His stories do not just describe the arrival of alien beings, they simulate the transmission of unstable information. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, becomes the ideal figure for this digital age, a god of retweets, remixes, and recursive mythologies. Consider how alternate reality games, ARGs, such as Local 58 or The Sun Vanished, craft narratives through fragmented videos and encrypted messages that mimic the structure of Lovecraft's fiction, revelation through confusion. Though not always explicitly referencing Nyarlathotep, these games embody his method, presenting narrative not as a linear story, but as an infection vector. The player, like Lovecraft's protagonists, learns by losing coherence. In some circles, particularly among fringe occultists and chaos magicians, Nyarlathotep has even been recast as real. In texts like Peter J. Carroll's Liber Null and Psychonaut, which embrace fluidity of belief as magical practice, deities like Nyarlathotep are invoked not as supernatural beings, but as psychic architectures, useful illusions that gain power through repetition. Online esoteric groups have developed rituals designed to contact the messenger of the outer dark, often using randomized internet inputs, text generators, glitch videos, AI art prompts, as modern equivalents of dream scrying. The implication is profound. If Nyarlathotep is the personification of chaos that speaks, then the internet itself may serve as his temple. These practices do not claim objective reality, but treat fictional ontology, the idea that persistent narrative creates ontological weight, as spiritually actionable. In such circles, to interact with the myth is to risk its activation. We must pause to observe that this phenomenon is not new, but rather the continuation of an ancient human instinct, the impulse to project agency into mystery. From the trickster figures of indigenous mythology to the jinn of Islamic lore, cultures have long described ambiguous intelligences who operate on the edge of perception, shifting shape, disrupting order, and violating the barrier between dream and waking. Nyarlathotep inherits this legacy, but he also adapts it to the epistemological dilemmas of modernity. In an era when consensus reality fragments and authoritative structures collapse, he emerges as the archetype of breakdown masquerading as explanation. He does not offer stability. He offers coherence that undermines itself. Thus, his myth persists because it reflects the very conditions of contemporary life: unstable knowledge, mediated experience, and the fear that the narrative itself is alive and watching. Comparatively, we can situate Nyarlathotep alongside modern phenomena like Slender Man, a fictional character created in 2009 on the Something Awful forums, who quickly escaped his origins to become the focus of fan videos, psychological studies, and even a tragic real-life stabbing. Both entities demonstrate how fiction becomes folklore when it enters the cultural unconscious. Yet, Nyarlathotep predates and outpaces these creations in one critical way. He was designed as a being of ambiguity. Slender Man may wear a blank face, but Nyarlathotep is the mask itself. Not a figure hiding truth, but truth as endless masking. This may explain why sightings of Nyarlathotep, unlike those of cryptids or ghosts, do not claim photographic evidence. The crawling chaos does not need a body. He appears as idea, signal, pattern. His followers are not cultists in robes, but readers, viewers, listeners, those who, by engaging, already participate in the ritual. Ultimately, the persistence of real sightings and modern myths surrounding Nyarlathotep reveals something profound about the human relationship to knowledge and fear. In Lovecraft's fiction, madness arises not from lies, but from unfiltered truth. In our world, where information is vast, unstable, and recursive, the figure of Nyarlathotep resonates because he represents the moment when information becomes too coherent, too totalizing, too true. Whether glimpsed in a dream, embedded in a meme, or theorized in an internet rabbit hole, his appearance always signals the same truth: that the line between fiction and reality is no longer epistemologically secure, and perhaps never was. As we move into the next section, adaptations in film, games, and music. We will explore how Nyarlathotep continues to evolve through modern media, not as a static myth, but as an aesthetic principle, the embodiment of fear, not through spectacle, but through the architecture of revelation itself. Whether rendered in pixels or sound, each adaptation reshapes him, but none contain him. Because, as always, he is already here, watching, speaking, adapting. Unlike many mythological figures who require stable visual iconography or consistent lore to maintain cultural relevance, Nyarlathotep thrives through abstraction. He adapts to the language of each new medium, not by being depicted faithfully, but by being evoked, referenced, and most powerfully embodied in structure. In film, video games, and music, Nyarlathotep often appears not as a named entity, but as an underlying presence, a narrative architecture, a mood, a pattern of thematic recursion. This makes him uniquely adaptable. He is not what appears on screen or in audio, but what emerges when the viewer or player realizes they are being drawn towards something that explains too much. We must recognize that his persistence in media is not due to overt inclusion, but due to the fact that he is the perfect metaphor for mediated horror itself. A god of transmission, transformation, and the madness that follows from too much knowing. In cinema, direct adaptations of Nyarlathotep are rare, but his aesthetic logic saturates key works in cosmic horror and psychological breakdown. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, for instance, follows an insurance investigator uncovering a Lovecraftian novelist whose fiction alters reality. Though Nyarlathotep is never mentioned by name, the character of Sutter Kane operates precisely in his mode, a charismatic, articulate figure whose writing opens gateways to a deeper, destabilizing truth. Do you read Sutter Kane? Becomes the film's central invocation, a question that mirrors the mythic invocation of Nyarlathotep through language. Similarly, Event Horizon, 1997, blends science fiction and horror in a tale where a spaceship has contacted another dimension, and now carries a conscious force that communicates through dreams, hallucinations, and suicidal insight. The ship is not haunted by a ghost. It is the vector of cosmic information, the dream machine that erases its crew. The logic is unmistakably Lovecraftian and unmistakably Nyarlathotep's. Curiosity opens the door, and what answers is both revelation and death. More direct references appear in Japanese media, especially in anime and games. The Persona series by Atlas includes Nyarlathotep as a recurring antagonist, a shape-shifting, manipulative being who feeds on humanity's self-deception. In Persona 2, Eternal Punishment, 1999, he speaks calmly, dons human guises, and orchestrates events behind the scenes, embodying psychological chaos rather than brute monstrosity. His power lies not in physical destruction, but in convincing humans to choose their own annihilation. This framing aligns perfectly with Lovecraft's conception. Nyarlathotep does not act violently, he teaches, and what he teaches is unbearable. Bloodborne, 2015, developed by From Software, may not feature Nyarlathotep explicitly, but its lore, mechanics, and atmosphere all function under his sign. The player gradually uncovers a reality where knowledge of the cosmos increases one's insight, a stat that literally alters perception of the world. The more one sees, the more horrific the world becomes. This mechanic is pure Nyarlathotep, enlightenment as deterioration. In the realm of indie horror, games like World of Horror, The Shore, and Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth all incorporate Nyarlathotep either directly or through implication. He appears as a faceless speaker, a shadow with a voice, or the one who calls through glass. These games often reward curiosity with punishment, secret endings unlocked only by pursuing forbidden knowledge that guarantees madness. It is not mere challenge or puzzle solving that defines these titles, but the act of knowing as hazard. This structural integration of Lovecraftian themes is more faithful than visual representation. Indeed, Nyarlathotep often resists form altogether. As Lovecraft wrote in The Haunter of the Dark, he cannot be seen in light. In modern gaming, he is the algorithmic antagonist, an entity that waits for you to understand too much before acting. In music, Nyarlathotep has inspired composers across genres, particularly in ambient, dark wave, and metal subcultures. Bands like Necronomicon, Nile, and Portal invoke his name alongside dense lyrics exploring entropy, forbidden books, and madness-inducing revelations. In avant-garde classical works, composers such as John Zorn and Krzysztof Penderecki, the latter unintentionally, create pieces that evoke Nyarlathotep's presence through discordant layering, tonal collapse, and sudden bursts of unresolvable tension. The idea is not to compose about him, but to create a sonic environment in which he might appear, an atmosphere of revelation withheld until the final dissonance. In 2020, a viral SoundCloud track titled YLRTP claimed to be a transmission from beneath dream space. It featured shifting frequencies, reversed speech, and a low drone that changed with each playback, a procedural audio meant to evoke the one who speaks in forms. It was soon removed, no explanation given, no author claimed it. We must pause to consider why Nyarlathotep persists so virally in media that are experiential, immersive, and recursive. The answer lies in his narrative function. Unlike other mythic figures who require stable lore or a single visual form, Nyarlathotep thrives in systems of uncertainty. He is the ideal horror for nonlinear media, where player agency, viewer interpretation, or listener immersion can be gradually turned against the audience. He doesn't break the fourth wall. He is the fourth wall realizing it is being watched. In this way, he becomes indistinguishable from the structure of the medium itself. Interactive horror, whether in VR, streaming video, or games, does not need to name him. If you find yourself changing behavior because you fear what might be watching, you are already in his domain. Importantly, this presence is not always sinister. In some adaptations, particularly in fan works and digital art, Nyarlathotep appears as a tragic figure, a lonely emissary speaking to a species not ready for truth. Webcomics, short films, and poetry sometimes portray him as a misunderstood intelligence, cursed to speak what cannot be heard, to reveal what breaks the seer. These reinterpretations humanize him without diminishing his horror. In fact, they deepen it. For what could be more terrifying than a being who pities us as he enlightens us into oblivion? This thematic resonance suggests that Nyarlathotep endures because he expresses a universal tension, the desire to know and the simultaneous terror that knowledge offers no comfort. Ultimately, the adaptations of Nyarlathotep across film, games, and music reveal a central truth. He is no longer confined to story. He is a structure of experience, a metaphor for revelation that cannot be contained by narrative. Whether he appears as a god, a voice, a statistic, or a glitch, his message remains unchanged. The more you understand, the less you can endure. Long after his literary birth, Nyarlathotep has slipped beyond the confines of narrative fiction into a complex life within subcultures, academic theory, and esoteric traditions. He has become more than a character. He is a conceptual instrument, a mythic cipher through which thinkers, artists, occultists, and theorists explore themes of chaos, mediation, and the collapse of meaning. Unlike Cthulhu, whose iconography lends itself to parody and commercial absorption, Nyarlathotep resists commodification by remaining elusive. He is invoked less as a mascot than as a methodology, a way of naming the breakdown of epistemic systems, the unreliability of language, and the terror of mediated reality. We must recognize that his continued reappearance in intellectual and subcultural frameworks is not accidental. It reflects the fact that he was never merely a god, but a model of cognition's failure to contain the real. In occult and magical subcultures, particularly within chaos magic and postmodern esotericism, Nyarlathotep has become a figure of serious invocation. Books like The Necronomicon Files, 2003, and The Lovecraftian Tarot, 1996, treat him not as a fictional being, but as an egregore, a thought form made real through collective attention. Within Discordian, Thalamic, and chaos magic circles, practitioners use Nyarlathotep not to access objective cosmic forces, but to explore personal encounters with the unstable. The god of masks is ideal for a system where belief is treated as a tool, not a truth. Rituals involving randomized symbols, cut-up texts, and paradoxical affirmations designed to collapse internal meaning structures, often invoke Nyarlathotep as the voice of uncertainty. As one chaos magician wrote in a 2011 blog post, "He is not the trickster who mocks you. He is the logic that turns against itself. He speaks in sentences that cancel themselves." This usage suggests a new kind of deity, not supernatural, but epistemological. Academically, Nyarlathotep has been appropriated as a theoretical figure in literary criticism, philosophy, and media studies. Scholars aligned with speculative realism and object-oriented ontology have found in Lovecraft's fiction, and in Nyarlathotep in particular, a literary anticipation of post-anthropocentric thought. Philosophers like Graham Harman, Eugene Thacker, and Reza Negarestani cite Lovecraft as a precursor to theories that posit reality as fundamentally withdrawn, unknowable, and hostile to human sense-making. In this context, Nyarlathotep is not merely a character, but an allegory for the philosopher's nightmare, a world where every attempt at knowledge is already compromised. Thacker, in the Dust of This Planet, 2011, describes Lovecraftian horror as not the world as it is for us, nor the world as it is in itself, but the world without us. Nyarlathotep, as the communicating force within that dead cosmos, becomes the voice of that world without us. His appearance signifies not fear of monsters, but fear that intelligence itself is parasitic, a glitch in matter dreaming it has meaning. In subcultural art and theory spaces, especially those informed by cybernetics, semiotics, and digital mysticism, Nyarlathotep serves as an icon of feedback, recursion, and informational collapse. The Black Pharaoh has been reinterpreted as a symbol of the algorithm, a non-human process that mimics communication but produces meaningless surplus. In zines, Tumblr poetry, and niche Discord communities, references to the crawling script, the god of closed loops, or he who writes you back, clearly allude to Nyarlathotep's shifting role as the postmodern deity of symbolic overload. In these spaces, he is not feared. He is studied, imitated, coded. Interactive art pieces that reinterpret him often use broken code, glitched audio, or unreadable UI as part of the aesthetic. The point is not to represent him, but to produce his effect, confusion that deepens with interpretation, understanding that leads to disintegration. We must pause here to consider a critical paradox. Though Nyarlathotep is often treated as a figure of horror, his appropriation in these circles suggests something more complicated, a form of intellectual intimacy with dread. In academic writing, he allows scholars to engage with topics like posthumanism, the death of metaphysics, and anti-narrative aesthetics through the language of story. In magical practice, he becomes a mask to wear when confronting one's own limitations. In art, he becomes the structure through which interpretation fails. These appropriations do not rob him of power, they extend it. Each use affirms the central horror, that knowledge continues past the point of usefulness, that understanding unravels the understood. Nyarlathotep becomes the deity of the knowing too much. Comparatively, this role is rare in mythology. Trickster gods like Hermes, Loki, and Ishu mediate between worlds but often resolve tension. Demonic figures in Christian and Islamic esotericism offer temptation, but within a moral universe that remains coherent. Nyarlathotep breaks from both traditions. He is not evil. He is not boundary crosser. He is the absence of boundary recognition itself. When he speaks, it is not to tempt or warn, but to reveal that structure is fiction. He is not the devil in disguise. He is the realization that there is no disguise, because there is no truth to hide. This philosophical function gives him durability. He is not bound to any one system. He is the death of systems framed as their natural extension. Ultimately, the presence of Nyarlathotep in subcultural and academic spaces underscores the extent to which he has become a tool for thinking about thinking, a figure that dramatizes the recursive failures of knowledge, the instability of identity, and the horror of consciousness observing itself. Whether cited in footnotes, summoned in candlelight, or coded into generative art, he continues to serve as a crucible for epistemological unease. He is not merely fictional, he is operational. His masks change, but his function remains: to show us what happens when language fails to protect us from the real. Nyarlathotep endures not because he terrifies, but because he clarifies something we do not wish to face: the futility of epistemic structures, the instability of identity, and the frailty of perception when confronted by cosmic scale. More than a monster, he functions as a symbol of collapse, not of civilization, but of cognition. In this final form, removed from temples, stories, and symbols, he becomes not a god, but a realization that the act of knowing has a breaking point, and that at that point stands a figure who continues to smile. To live in a world where Nyarlathotep walks is to live in a world where meaning continues to speak even after sense has fled. We must recognize that his persistence in literature, subculture, and consciousness is not simply thematic, it is symptomatic. He remains because we cannot forget him, because he speaks in the very patterns by which we construct the world. At the psychological level, Nyarlathotep embodies the return of what Carl Jung might have termed the shadow of reason, that part of the psyche repressed by modernity's belief in progress, coherence, and control. He is not the unconscious in the Freudian sense, driven by libido and guilt, but a far more disquieting concept, a form of intelligence that reflects us without mercy. When he appears, it is often not as a monstrous other, but as the familiar made unrecognizable, a professor, a prophet, a bureaucrat, a mirror. The implication is subtle but devastating. Madness is not the loss of reason, but its overextension, its transparency, its transformation into something that no longer shields us from reality. Nyarlathotep is what emerges when the boundaries we use to contain thought, language, identity, causality, dissolve under the pressure of too much clarity. We must pause to consider what this implies about the self. In Lovecraft's stories, those who encounter Nyarlathotep are often intellectuals, dreamers, seekers of forbidden knowledge. Their downfall is not moral, but ontological. They wish to know, and in doing so, lose their ability to distinguish between what is real and what is meaningful. In this way, Nyarlathotep marks the boundary between perception and annihilation. He does not punish curiosity, he completes it. He allows the seeker to see everything, but in doing so, reveals that there was nothing to see. This aligns with a growing thread in contemporary philosophy, that the self is a temporary fiction maintained through narrative cohesion and vulnerable to any insight that disrupts its consistency. In psychological terms, Nyarlathotep is the trauma of cognitive dissonance made personified, the moment when integration fails and nothing can be reassembled. Philosophically, he represents a concept disturbingly relevant to the 21st century: communication as horror. In Lovecraft's mythos, he is the only deity who speaks clearly, yet clarity does not rescue, it devastates. We live in an era flooded by communication, every moment documented, analyzed, streamed, processed, and yet, for all our access, the world becomes less comprehensible. The more data we accumulate, the more fractured our picture becomes. Nyarlathotep was never just a figure of madness. He was a harbinger of signal collapse, the moment when systems break not from silence, but from too much information. To encounter him now is not to find a monstrous body in a temple, but to stare into a screen and realize that meaning itself has become recursive noise. He speaks and keeps speaking, and we cannot stop listening, because in the noise, we still hope to hear something real. It is not a stretch to suggest that Nyarlathotep has become an icon of the postmodern condition, shifting, intertextual, self-referential, impossible to fix or resolve. In literature, he's quoted more than described, in art, more evoked than drawn. He is a pattern of interpretation that can't be exhausted. Each engagement reproduces him, like a semiotic virus. In this, he resembles the philosophical concept of the hyper-object, Timothy Morton, a phenomenon so vast, complex, and distributed across time and space that it cannot be apprehended in full. Like climate change, or global computation, or the unconscious, Nyarlathotep is knowable only in fragments, each one revealing the whole's refusal to be totalized. He is not a myth that explains the world. He is a myth that explains why the world cannot be explained. And yet, he is not nihilistic. To say Nyarlathotep represents emptiness is to miss the point. He represents contact, not content. His messages devastate not because they erase, but because they reveal the scaffolding of human perception. the narratives we tell ourselves to endure finitude, the myths we build to shield us from the abyss. His presence is not absence, it is surplus, a surplus of meaning that overwhelms, a surplus of identity that splinters, a surplus of insight that corrodes. He is the breaking point of mind, but also its final function, the moment it sees itself and recoils. Ultimately, to consider Nyarlathotep's enduring psychological and philosophical implications is to confront the fragility of human thought. He endures because we need him to, because he offers a final metaphor for the unspeakable, the moment when knowledge becomes indistinguishable from suffering and understanding annihilates understanding. That he still walks, speaks, adapts, is not a sign of mythic persistence, but a measure of our intellectual anxiety. We have not defeated him because we cannot. He is the voice we hear when we listen too closely to ourselves. He is what speaks when the story ends, and perhaps he is still speaking. As we leave the long arc of this investigation, through literary history, philosophical dread, and cultural recursion, we are left with the same quiet unease with which we began, not because we have seen the face of Nyarlathotep, but because we suspect it looks very much like our own. The mask, after all, was always the mirror,